So I'm going to talk just a little bit about perception of others, as a few people were interested in that. It's not really my background, and I'm going to probably start with this paper that was more looks like a chapter of a book that was put out by Washington State University. It is it's a good chapter. I just felt like they were trying to give as much information as possible. And so a lot of the concepts ended up being explained really quickly and without a lot of research and evidence. So I'm going to pick and choose what I felt was interesting of that. And then the other was an old article by Alfonso F. Lingus from the 1970s. I'm not sure how much I'm going to touch on that one. It depends on how long I spend on this first one. I will say there will be aspects or times when I talk a little bit about self-perception because of the influence our perception of ourselves has on our perception of others. And we see this as being very broken down and very different in the book chapter, which is true, that we have the fundamental attribution error. We have that for other people. We give ourselves a lot of reasons why we are behaving this way that are rather situational, and for others we see their behavior and don't think about what is the situation that other person is in. But there's also, coming from self-perception, there's a great deal of projection, and some of that is conscious, but some of that is below our conscious level, where we feel something about ourselves, and so we project that onto other people and kind of start to see that in other people, and it's not necessarily really who they are. So there's a complex mixture of things going on when we are perceiving other people and we're making these kind of assumptions about other people. I really did like it that this chapter started out with that, even though it was really brief, that explanation of the nervous system and sensation and perception and some of these aspects of just our background processing in general and how that works. And it's a good time to remind you. So when we started out the semester, I distinguished between sensation and perception, how sensation is just what's hitting those sensory receptors, but perception is our experience of the world, our conscious experience of the world, and it really is filtered through whatever. So our subcortical structures, our cortical structures, our prefrontal cortex, and how our sort of judgments and affect, all of that is influencing how we are perceiving the world. And if we're taking this into how we are perceiving other people, this is equally true. So we take in information like, what do they look like, whether that is about their personal physical appearance or whether that is about the clothing they wear, or other things that are tied to them that are visual. What do they sound like? Do they tend to touch somebody, or do they ever touch me? I'm not going to talk so much about taste, but I wanted to leave that in there as one of our sensory experiences. But smell, right? And what do they smell like? And I think it's really important to realize that all of that, we are taking in all of that information when we are experiencing another person, and it leads to this kind of social cognition. So when we talk about cognition, we usually talk about those information processing systems, right? Of how do we process information, how do we store information, how do we retrieve and access information so that we can utilize it. And this is in a social setting. How do we process, store, and retrieve information and apply that information to our inferences about other people? They start the chapter by talking about the types of information that we are taking in and about other people that lead to different kinds of inferences. And they start by talking about salience, which is another nice kind of harkening back to the beginning of the semester, well, really when we were talking about visual attention, that things that are salient are going to capture our attention, and so we're more likely to take in that information. And things that are salient are more likely to pop out as the figure when we think about the figure versus ground. And they have this great example, I liked it a lot, of the person in the library who is, she's wearing all black, maybe a black leather jacket, earrings, nose rings, you know, you can see all the jewelry and maybe some tattoos and maybe some different colors in her hair. And this goth woman is sticking out, right? She's salient when we're looking around at the library. She looks very different and she contrasts, right, with her surroundings. Whereas if I was to wear what I might wear, something more conservative, what I might wear to a conference, like my blazer pantsuit, if I went to see a metal show, I'm going to be the person standing out and being kind of the salient figure, because I'm not fitting in so well with the other people around me as far as appearance. Other types of information that we are taking in about people, though, we do take into account their facial expressions, and some of this is things that we're very conscious of and are very obvious. So whether they are smiling, whether they seem sad, whether they have a crinkle in their brow and maybe they look a little bit perturbed or upset. I think I keep forgetting the author's names, but I'll look it up before the next slide. They talk about even the difference between the Duchenne smile. So what is a real smile that we see both in the mouth and cheeks and in the eyes, and the kind of non-Duchenne smile of when we are smiling to be polite, that a lot of that is very consciously obvious to us, but there's a lot about people's facial expressions that are influencing us less consciously as well. Personality traits, I think they just talk about introversion versus extroversion, but all kinds of personality traits that we can see in somebody, whether they are just talkative and chatty, whether they stand by themselves at a party, maybe a little bit more introverted, but even things where we can see some emotional outburst and maybe they seem a little bit potentially neurotic, or people that we're more likely to meet at a museum or places where people are traveling, those kind of more openness to experience, that all of those traits we take into account when we see them, when they are something we can witness and observe. Eye contact is very important to people, and I can't remember the percentages, so if you're really interested, you'll have to go to the chapter and look them up, but people who make too little eye contact tend to, especially if they're giving a speech or talking, or your professor or something, and they're not making enough eye contact, they tend to be interpreted as not being as confident, or maybe as knowing their material as well. People that we even see anywhere, if they're not making any eye contact, there's almost this feeling that maybe they've done something wrong, or they don't want to. Maybe they don't have confidence. Whereas we can go the other direction too, of making too much eye contact. So people who make too much eye contact, they tend to unnerve people a little bit. They tend to almost feel to the other person like they're being dominating in their kind of eye contact, so there's a balance in our eye contact. And I think in this chapter they mention how usually what we do is when we're speaking, we're not as likely to make eye contact, but when we're listening to somebody else speak, we tend to make eye contact, and that's to really kind of show somebody that we are listening to them. That is not true in all cultures. So in some cultures, it's much more common to make eye contact when you're speaking to them, and less common to make eye contact when you're listening to them speak. Moral character. So we can listen to what people say and sometimes believe them and sometimes not, but when we really see aspects of their morality and the way they treat people, or the way they might stand up for somebody, or the way they don't stand up for somebody, if we see somebody potentially taking money from a cash register, or stealing or cheating, we are making inferences and assumptions about those people. And then nonverbal communication, which is another one. I can't remember exactly what they say. I read it last night, but one of the studies that I sometimes talk about is this study where the students were rating the professor. They weren't even listening to what the professor was saying. They were just watching a recording of the professor, and they made ratings. And those ratings, based on that nonverbal communication of the professor, actually played out and were very highly correlated with the actual evaluations from that professor's students. We get a lot from nonverbal communication. When I talk about this in brain and behavior and this kind of, and sometimes we have a real emotional reaction to nonverbal communication. And I usually use that example of arms akimbo. Like, so when you put your hands on your hips and your arms are kind of sticking out, that can give somebody else an impression that they are in trouble. And it doesn't really matter what they're saying to you. It feels a little bit like you're in trouble. And arms kind of open is a much more open stance, like you're open and willing to accept things. There's arms kind of closed in front of you, so crossed arms, which tends to suggest that you are closed off and not so willing to listen to other people. And it can be such that, so sometimes I used to use the example of the Thomas Cooper Library, that a lot of the times the librarians did have those closed arms, but sometimes it was also cold in there. Well, it's cold in there and they're crossing their arms because it's cold, but it does give the patrons this feeling, right? Because we're having these really kind of emotional responses to this nonverbal, to this body language, and it can give people this feeling that they are kind of closed off. But that's not the impression that they want to give. Librarians are the most helpful people you'll ever meet in your life. That's just, it's kind of cold in there. Some of what the authors talk about, I put into these kind of just background aspects of how we are perceiving others. And one is our own emotional state, where we can set up a perceptual set. And if you go back and think about top-down processing and how I set up, so the females, I think, saw the rat, and the males saw a man's face, and then I showed this really ambiguous figure where now the females perceived that as a rat or a mouse, and the males perceive that as a man's face. That cognitive perceptual set, that can happen when we are interpreting other people based on basically our own emotional state at the time. If I'm in a really good mood and I meet this new person who's kind of, let's say, comical and funny or whatever, that I can be laughing and enjoying that, and I interpret that as comical and funny. I interpret that person as being a funny person and maybe sweet and kind. And if I'm in a really bad mood and I've had some bad things happen, or I'm in a really negative emotional state, and that person is making the same jokes, I might interpret those as being, against other people or against me, or it might set off some triggers where I'm not interpreting that person in the same way, and it's based on my emotional state, which is setting up this perceptual set. So as we get into perceiving others, it's not just this kind of normative experience of sensation to perception, that we need to talk about some of these cognitive influences on perception. And one of the big cognitive influences on how we perceive the world is our categories and schemas of the world. So unfortunately, we put people into categories, just like we categorize things like dogs and chairs and tables and cats. Those things have their categories, and certain things fit into those categories and certain things don't. We also have our schemas of when we meet somebody in a particular role in our lives, that we assign aspects of the expectations of that role to that person, whether that is somebody, whether that is our wait staff, whether that is somebody at the grocery store checking us out, the bag people at the grocery store, the postal worker, And for me, of course, since I'm a professor, there are certain schemata about teachers that people start to either try to apply to me or to not apply to me, or to see how maybe different or the same that I am. I, in my lifetime, have been a scientist, a librarian, and now I'm a professor. And I feel like once I really start getting identified with that role, I get a little bit uncomfortable, and I really need to stay where I am for various reasons. But so every time people meet me, they have all of the schemata that they have built depending on the kinds of teachers they've had, and they're kind of comparing me and putting me, where do I land in those schemas or schemata. We also have person schema, so a schema for a particular person, which will probably involve some of their more noticeable personality traits. I think your author, when he's talking about personality traits, starts talking about somebody at his gym who works there, who's kind of extroverted, and so she's really kind of chatty and talks a lot, and he can actually sometimes hear her over his headphones. Well, that becomes part of that person's person schema. So you all probably have this schema of me that I talk a lot, whereas in actuality, I'm not the talker usually. But things get applied to a person as we're experiencing that person. And then if that woman has a quiet day where she's kind of quieter than usual, you might actually think something's wrong. We also have event schemas, or they're actually called scripts, where when we go to a restaurant or something like, or a movie theater or whatever, we have the event kind of set in our mind, and we have expectations of things like when we're going to order, when we're going to pay, when we're going to eat, when we're going to go in, when we're going to pay for our ticket, when we're going to see the movie, when we're going to leave. All of those, that kind of script that we have, also fit under these schemas that we are creating from experiences in our lives. Some of the problems with schemas include that this is kind of where group stereotypes come from, that we're using a heuristic to understand a group of people, and so we're not really understanding that group of people. And I think your authors talk about whether this is due to prototypes, that we've created some prototypical example, or whether this is due to exemplars, that one of the theories of how this all works is that we take in every single instance and basically average that into an exemplar of a category, regardless of how that heuristic is working. This is how stereotypes are created. Some of the benefits of schemas are that we are able to use these heuristics in order to predict and have a beneficial and predictive future interaction a lot of the time with other people, just because we know what to expect when we go to a restaurant, how to relate with our waitstaff, or with our grocery store clerk, or whatever, or whoever we're working with. The accuracy of schemas is questionable. So we have a few things that influence our schemas. One is belief perseverance. So once we have had an initial reaction with a stranger or people in particular roles, we start to have this idea of how that's going to work out for us, either with that particular person, or with the person schema, or in particular roles with the role schema. And that can be problematic, especially if some of those early experiences are not so good. The primacy effect is also something to consider, that our very first impression with a particular schema. So those, if you think about teachers and professors, those really early teachers had a powerful effect on your role schema for teachers for the rest of your life. The same thing with police officers, or as we get to specific people, our first impressions of those people are really important. Everybody says the first impression is really important. Well, we build our impressions over time, but they're correct that there is this kind of primacy effect. We also tend to have this kind of confirmatory hypothesis testing. What we tend to do, or confirmation bias, that what we tend to do with our testing of our hypotheses about how the world works or about how people work, what we tend to do is have a hypothesis and look for evidence to support that hypothesis. Whereas in science, what we notice as what's truly important for moving science forward is finding evidence, looking for evidence to potentially disprove our hypotheses, because we can confirm a hypothesis over and over and over again, but once that hypothesis is disproved even one time, then we need to go back and rethink that hypothesis. And yet we all have this kind of confirmation bias. We look for confirmation of what we already believe. In fact, there is research showing that if I'm, let's say, a Democrat, and I'm listening to another Democrat give me information, that I will have more activity in my hippocampus than if I am a Democrat and I'm listening to a Republican give me information, then I have more activity in my prefrontal cortex, almost like I'm arguing with that person in my head, and less activity in my hippocampus than if I'm actually listening to a Democrat, because that's the information that I believe, and so that's the information I'm going to lay down. So we have a really strong confirmation bias, and all of us do. I looked at the time, and this is running a bit longer than I expected, so I want to finish up by at least addressing a little bit attribution theory, and I'm not going to address the whole theory. All of this, I've been saying they, and maybe sometimes he by accident, that this all comes from Principles of Social Psychology by Lee Daffin and Carrie Lane, which came out in January of 2021 from Washington State University. Attribution theory involves what kind of attributions are we making to ourselves versus what kind of attributions are we making to other people. And one of, I think, the most important things to understand about our own perceptions of other people is this fundamental attribution error, that we tend to make an error in assigning a cause to another person's behavior. We automatically assume some kind of dispositional reason for their behavior, and then we ignore, or either we ignore or we don't understand or we don't see all the situational factors. And we tend to, for our own behavior, we tend to say, it's about the situation that I'm in. I didn't explode in anger because I'm an angry person. I exploded in anger because, one thing happened today and then another, and then this happened and then that happened, and then I had another trigger and then another bad thing, and then I was late, and then this and then this, and the situation led me into this explosion. But when we see somebody else have this kind of explosive anger or depressive episode or something that's going on with them, we tend to say that appears to be their disposition. That seems to be something about them. But we don't see all of those situational factors, and so we don't know what led up to their explosion. And I think calling this a fundamental error is really important and something for us to consider, again, when we are seeing other people and when we are making interpretations of how other people are acting. Okay, so I thought I'd come back to this picture because it's kind of neat just to end everything, and I am at about 25 minutes, so sorry I'm getting this up late, but it's kind of what happened, and I'm hoping to see you all in the discussion, at least some people today. Hope everyone's doing well.